My name is Margaret Holloway, and tonight, my daughter's voice cut deeper than any knife. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The clinking of forks and plates should have been a comforting sound. Dinner for most families is a time of warmth, chatter, and shared laughter. But in my house, it had become a battlefield I never asked for. My daughter sat across from me, her eyes sharp, her lips curled with that familiar disdain I've come to dread. It started with something small, an innocent comment about her work schedule. I asked her how she was managing her long hours, whether she was eating enough. A simple question, one that any mother might ask out of care. But her reply was a dagger dipped in sarcasm. Maybe if you weren't so clueless about the modern world, Mom, you wouldn't sound so pathetic every time you open your mouth. The table fell silent. My fork paused midway to my plate. Her tone carried no jest, no hint of playful banter, just cold dismissal. I looked to my husband hoping for some intervention, but he only stared down at his plate. My son shifted awkwardly, avoiding my eyes. It was as if the whole family had grown used to this ritual, my daughter hurling her insults and me absorbing them like a sponge. I forced a smile, though I could feel it trembling on my lips. "I was only concerned about your health," I murmured, trying to smooth the jagged edges of the moment. But she only scoffed, picking at her food as though the conversation was already beneath her. The worst part wasn't the insult itself. It was the way everyone else pretended not to notice, as though my humiliation was an acceptable price for keeping the peace. Inside, I felt the sting grow sharper. I could hear my own voice echoing in my head. "Why do you let her do this to you, Margaret?" But I knew why. For years I told myself that if I stayed gentle, patient, and accommodating, she would one day recognize my love, that if I gave her no reason to resent me, she would come back to me with respect and gratitude. Yet here I was, sitting in silence at my own dinner table, feeling like an unwanted guest in my daughter's world. I chewed slowly, more out of habit than hunger, my eyes blurring as I stared at the plate. I didn't cry, at least not yet, but a heaviness pressed against my chest, threatening to burst the moment I was alone. When dinner ended, I gathered the dishes, letting the others drift off into their routines. My daughter was already scrolling on her phone, laughter spilling from her lips at something one of her friends must have sent. The same lips that had curled in disgust when speaking to me only moments ago. I washed the plates with hands that trembled slightly, staring at my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman who stared back looked older than I remembered. Not just in years, but in spirit. Is this what motherhood has come to, I thought? Giving and giving until there's nothing left, only to be treated like a burden. When I finally retreated to my room, I shut the door quietly and let the tears fall. No audience, no forced composure. Just me, the sound of my sobs muffled against the pillow. That night, her words replayed in my mind like a cruel refrain. Every insult she had ever thrown at me seemed to resurface, piling one on top of another, until they formed a mountain of hurt too heavy to carry. And yet I carried it, because I always had. But something in me shifted as I lay there. A small, stubborn ember began to glow deep in my chest. An ember that whispered, "How much longer will you let this continue, Margaret?" I didn't know it yet, but that night was the first step toward change. Toward reclaiming the dignity I had lost in my endless efforts to please a daughter who seemed determined to despise me. And though I hadn't spoken it aloud, a thought settled firmly into my mind. This time, I won't try to please her anymore. That night, after the house fell into silence, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The faint ticking of the clock on the nightstand was the only sound, steady and indifferent, as if mocking the storm that churned inside me. I had cried into my pillow until my tears dried into salt against my cheeks. The insult she threw at me during dinner still rang in my ears, a line sharpened to cut. "Maybe if you weren't so clueless, Mom." It wasn't the first time, and God knows it wouldn't be the last. But that evening, something felt different. I tried to breathe deeply, tried to remind myself of her long work hours, her stress, the difficult world she navigated. I told myself, like I always did, that maybe her cruelty wasn't really about me. Maybe she was just lashing out. Maybe she'd had a hard day. But how many maybes had I used to excuse her behavior? Dozens, hundreds. And every time it was my dignity, I chipped away at my silence that kept the peace, while she sharpened her tongue on me. I rolled onto my side and looked at the framed photograph on my dresser. It was of her when she was 5 years old, grinning with two missing front teeth, her little hands clutching the hem of her birthday dress. I remember that day vividly. I had stayed up half the night baking a cake in the shape of a butterfly because she had insisted she didn't want just a normal cake. And when she saw it, her eyes had sparkled, and she had thrown her arms around my neck, whispering, "You're the best mommy." When had that little girl vanished? At what point did her love curdle into disdain? I closed my eyes, but the questions refused to let me sleep. Instead, memories marched through my mind unbidden. Her teenage years when I overlooked her slammed doors and sarcastic sighs, telling myself it was just a phase. Her college days when my phone calls often went unanswered and my texts returned with one-word replies. Even then, I believed stubbornly, desperately that once she matured, she would see me differently. But maturity hadn't softened her. If anything, it seemed to harden her further. Lying in the dark, I whispered aloud, "Why am I still trying?" My voice cracked on the words as if even my throat was weary of repeating them. I thought about the countless ways I'd bent myself to please her. The clothes I bought her when money was tight. The weekends I gave up to help with her school projects. The hours I spent listening to her vent about friends' boys' jobs, all while swallowing my own hurt so she could feel heard. And what did I get in return? Scorn, mockery, silence where affection used to live. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until stars flared behind my lids. The pain was sharper than I expected, but it felt almost cleansing, like I needed a physical ache to match the emotional one. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered again, this time with more resolve. The truth was simple, though. Brutal, every attempt to win her love had only fed her contempt. The more I tried, the less she respected me. She treated me like a doormat because I behaved like one always lying flat for her to walk across. My heart clenched at the thought because it meant acknowledging my own role in this cycle. I had let her believe it was acceptable. I had taught her through silence and self-sacrifice that I would endure anything just to keep her close. But close to what the daughter I remembered no longer existed. What remained was a woman who saw me not as her mother, but as something disposable. Tears welled again, but this time they didn't spill. I blinked them back, letting my chest rise and fall slowly. Somewhere inside me, beneath the exhaustion and despair, a stubborn ember glowed. Maybe I couldn't change her. Maybe her view of me was twisted beyond repair. But I could change myself. I could stop giving her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch, stop handing her my heart to shred every time she opened her mouth. I sat up in bed, swinging my legs to the floor. The carpet was cold beneath my bare feet, grounding me. In the quiet, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. From that moment forward, I promised myself I would no longer cry alone in the dark after her insults. I would not beg for scraps of affection. I would not contort myself into someone else just to earn her love. If she wanted to see me as pathetic, so be it. But I would no longer help her paint that picture. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I made a vow I will not try to please her anymore. It was a vow whispered into the shadows, unheard by anyone but me. Yet it felt monumental, as though I had finally placed the first stone of a wall between her cruelty and my heart. And though I didn't know it yet, that vow would change everything. Morning always smelled like cinnamon in those days, because I insisted on sprinkling it over toast to make breakfast feel like a small celebration. Lena, back then still my sunbeam with tangled hair and socks that never matched, would shuffle into the kitchen, dragging her blanket like a cape. She'd climb onto the chair, knees tucked, and watch me butter bread with the solemn attention of a scientist. When I slid the plate to her, her whole face lit up as if I'd handed her a crown. Again, she'd say after the first bite, and I would even if it meant I'd be late for first period. I remember the first fever that scared me. She was 3 burning hot and limp in my arms while rain rat-a-tat-tatted against the window. I sat on the bathroom floor with her steam rising from a hot shower, counting out loud to slow my own heart. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, rocking her gently whispering the last lines of poems I'd taught to teenagers that morning. When the fever finally broke at dawn, I held her and cried into her curls, relief shaking through me like a sob I couldn't stop. She woke and patted my face with a small hand. "Don't cry, Mommy," she said, and at that moment I believed love was something you could hold with both arms and never lose. We had rituals. On Saturdays, we'd go to the library when the doors first opened and claim the sunny corner by the window. She'd curl up in my lap while I read Charlotte's Web, Anne of Green Gables' The Secret Garden, giving each character a different voice until my throat went hoarse. She drew spiders and barns in crayon and insisted that Charlotte was secretly our neighbor living in the porch rafters. On the way home, we'd stop by the florist just to smell things. She'd bury her face in peonies and sneeze herself silly. "Bless you," I'd say laughing, and she'd pretend to catch each blessing like a firefly and put it in her pocket. We made a kite, 1 spring crimson paper and a tail of ripped bedsheets, because store-bought felt too easy. It nosedived 12 times before we coaxed it into the wind. When it finally climbed, Lena ran across the field in bright yellow rain boots, even though there wasn't any rain, shouting, "Look, Mommy, it likes me." I took a picture of her that day, cheeks flushed, eyes squinting, hair whipped wild. I still have it tucked into a novel on my nightstand. Sometimes I think I should hide it farther away so it will hurt less to find, but I never do. There were lean years, too. The district froze raises, and your father, my husband, missed a bonus that would have patched a roof leak. I picked up extra tutoring after school, and on weekends telling myself the fatigue was a badge of honor. When the field trip to the Science Museum came around and Lena's eyes begged before her mouth did, I posted a stack of old books online and sold them one by one. First editions I'd loved so much I'd underlined them in pencil as softly as a kiss. I told myself I could always reread the words from memory, but if she missed the trip, I'd remember that too. She brought home a plastic astronaut from the gift shop and slept with it gripped in her hand for weeks, the head denting her cheek by morning. "I'm going to space," she whispered into the dark. "I believe you," I whispered back. She was 10 when she auditioned for the school play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, tiny fairies with glittery wings and a dress I stayed up late to sew because nothing in the stores felt like her. The sewing machine hiccuped and snarled, but I fed it steady anyway, hand on the fabric as if guiding a skittish horse. On opening night, I watched from the second row while she floated across the stage like a slice of moon. Afterward, she barreled into me in the hallway, glitter sticking to my sweater. "You came," she said, breathless, as if there were ever a universe where I wouldn't. There were scrapes and splinters. A mean girl in 5th grade called her weird for bringing a book to recess, and she cried on the back steps with her head buried in my lap. I told her that weird is what the world calls you right before it learns to envy your courage. We wrote an acrostic poem, W for wild E, for excellent I, for irreplaceable R, for radiant D, for determined, and taped it to her mirror. For a month she checked it every morning like armor before battle. I missed some things too because life is a jealous accountant. A parent meeting ran long and I walked into the gym just as the final whistle blew on her first basketball game. She scanned the bleachers for my face and found me late with my apology already halfway down my throat. We drove home in silence until I pulled into the ice cream shop and ordered the largest sundae they had. We ate it with 2 spoons and brain-freeze tears, and ended up laughing so hard the server laughed with us. "I'm sorry," I said for the 1000th time. Lena leaned her head on my shoulder, sticky sweet and forgiving. "You made it," she said, which was kinder than I deserved. And then, as if all that tenderness had been a prologue, written in a softer ink, the edges began to harden. It was slow at first. A sigh when I asked about homework. An eye roll when I reminded her to bring a jacket. The first slammed door rattled the hallway, pictures our faces briefly blurred in the glass like strangers. I told myself it was weather passing over a sturdy house. I had seen teenagers, hundreds of them, get lost and find themselves again. I believed we would arc the same way back toward each other as reliably as the tide. When Lena turned 14, her world expanded beyond the borders of our home, and I stood at the fence watching it happen. Friends with eyes lined black and laughter that dared adults to speak. Boys who smelled like car exhaust and cologne. Late-night phone calls, whispers, and giggles that stopped when I entered the room. I made snacks and retreated to the kitchen, trying to be the kind of mother whose presence makes space rather than closes it. "I trust you," I'd say at the door, meaning it, handing over the car keys with a smile that fought not to tremble. She'd take them without looking, the thanks tossed like a coin into a fountain she no longer believed in. I caught myself bargaining with fate. If I am patient, she will soften. If I am gentle, she will hear me. If I never raise my voice, she will respect me. I read articles, I joined a parent forum. I rehearsed new phrases in my head so my concern wouldn't sound like control. "I notice you're tired. How can I help? I'm here if you want to talk." I left notes in her lunch bag. "You are brave. You are loved." Sometimes they came home crumpled among peels and napkins, and I smoothed them out over the sink as if wrinkleless paper could be proof that something hadn't been thrown away. The day she got into her first choice college, we danced in the kitchen. I lifted her hand above her head and twirled her like I had when she was tiny. She laughed and let me, then pulled free and spun alone, hair flaring out in a glossy halo. I cried again, joy this time, and promised myself I would never take credit. I would not say, "We did it," even though I had written checks at midnight and grade papers until my vision blurred, so we could afford every test prep class she wanted. "You did it," I told her, and meant it. She tossed her acceptance letter onto the counter and texted half the world. I watched the curve of her smile and thought, if it costs me to be unseen, I will pay and pay and pay. Maybe that is when the ledger tilted, when love became currency, and I kept spending long after the balance had gone red. If I am honest, there were warnings I never wanted to read. She teased me in front of her friends, a harmless jab about my old phone, a joke about the way I mispronounced a slang word. "It's cute," she said, cheeks pink with delight. I laughed with them because I wanted to be the mother who didn't bruise. Later in bed, I pressed my hand to my chest where the laughter had stung and told myself not to be dramatic. But memory is a faithful archivist. It sets the sweetness beside the ache and refuses to choose. When I look back now, I hold both Lena asleep on my shoulder in a bus rumbling toward a museum, and Lena at a dinner table calling me clueless, the word passing her lips like something she had practiced to get the cadence just right. I think of the butterfly cake, the way her face shone at 5, and I can almost hear her little voice again. "You're the best, Mommy." The echo breaks something tender in me even now. I didn't become smaller overnight. I shrank in increments, bending toward the child I adored until bending became the only posture I knew. Maybe that's why the vow I made last night felt both foreign and familiar, like a language I once spoke fluently and forgot. I loved her with my whole life. I still do. But love without dignity will drown you. And somewhere between cinnamon toast and slammed doors, I learned to breathe water. The memories do not absolve her, but they explain me. They explain why I stayed so long in a place that hurt, why I kept smoothing crumpled notes, why I kept believing that the tide would turn. It didn't, so I will. Outside my window, the neighborhood is waking, garbage truck groaning, a dog barking, twice the faint thud of a paper on a porch. I make tea. I stand at the sink, steam fogging the glass, and I watch the lemon slice turn slow circles in the mug. The past is there with me, bright as the kite we coaxed into the sky, but the string is in my hand now. I can feel the pull of it, steady and sure. And for the first time in a long time, I don't look over my shoulder to see if anyone approves. I used to think distance between mother and daughter happened in a single dramatic instant, an argument that severed ties, a betrayal that drew a clean line in the sand. But in my house, it was more like fog creeping in, subtle, almost invisible at first. You don't realize how thick it's become until you can no longer see the path you were walking together. The first signs were small enough that I brushed them aside. I remember one afternoon when Lena was about 16. I'd spent the morning making her favorite soup chicken and wild rice because I knew she had a long day ahead with exams. I placed the steaming bowl in front of her, smiling the way mothers do when they're proud of such a small act of love. She barely looked up. "Ugh, Mom. Do you ever make anything else? It's always old people food with you." Her words weren't meant as a dagger, not like the ones she'd fling later, but they landed somewhere deep. I laughed weakly, told her I'd try something different next time, and carried her bowl back to the kitchen. I told myself she was just tired, stressed, or maybe embarrassed by the way I hovered. But that night, when she ordered takeout with her friends and left my soup untouched on the counter, something inside me wilted. Another time I reminded her to bring a jacket before going out. The autumn air had been biting all day, and I could already imagine her shivering at the bus stop. She rolled her eyes and muttered, "God, you act like I'm 5." It was such a common teenage phrase that it shouldn't have stuck. But the tone, sharp dismissive, settled into me like a bruise. I smiled anyway, forced lightness into my voice. Mothers can't help themselves. She left without a jacket, of course. When she came home hours later with flushed cheeks and red hands, I wanted to say, "I told you so." Instead, I fetched a blanket, draped it around her shoulders, and made hot chocolate. She didn't thank me. She barely even noticed. Looking back, I wonder if that was the moment I began confusing love with servitude. The signs multiplied as she grew older. Our once-long talks on the porch dwindled into one-word answers. She used to tell me everything: how a friend hurt her feelings, which boy made her laugh in class, how she worried about the future. Now she guarded her phone like a secret diary, smiling at texts she never shared. When she did talk, it was often laced with condescension. She corrected me on the way. I pronounced new slang, snickered at my confusion over apps, dismissed my questions about her life as if they were interruptions. Each time I told myself it was normal. Teenagers pull away. They're supposed to write. But there's a difference between pulling away and pushing someone down. One evening, she invited friends over to study. I made snacks, trying not to hover, listening from the kitchen as laughter spilled down the hallway. Then I heard her voice, louder than the rest, mimicking me. "Lena, did you eat? Lena, don't forget your jacket. Lena, are you warm enough?" The group erupted in laughter. My face burned. I wanted to storm into the room to tell her that love should not be something you mock. Instead, I stood in the dark kitchen holding a tray of cookies I suddenly couldn't bear to serve. I ate one in silence, the sugar bitter on my tongue, and put the rest back in the tin. That night, I told myself it was harmless, just kids being kids. But when I crawled into bed, the laughter still echoed in my ears, crueler than it probably was in reality. The gap between us widened in ways I couldn't measure. It wasn't just her words, it was her eyes. The way she looked at me as though I were an obstacle instead of a mother. As though my love embarrassed her more than it comforted her. And still I tried harder. I bought her clothes I couldn't afford, hoping the fabric might weave us closer again. I gave her freedom before she earned it, hoping she'd return with gratitude. I told myself, she'll see. One day, she'll see. But she never did. Each sacrifice only seemed to feed her contempt. The more I gave, the less she respected me. I think about those moments often now, as if replaying them could rewrite them. If I had spoken up, if I had said, "That hurt me," or I deserve respect, maybe things would have been different. But I didn't. I swallowed my pride in silence, mistaking endurance for love. The distance didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like fog. And by the time I realized how lost I was inside it, Lena was no longer the little girl running through fields with a kite. She was someone else entirely, someone who saw me as a shadow and treated me like one too. And in my silence, I let her. I don't know when it started exactly, this compulsion to bend, to smooth every wrinkle in her life, as if my job were to be her silent servant rather than her mother. Perhaps it began in the small things, the little apologies I offered when I'd done nothing wrong. Sorry I embarrassed you. Sorry I asked too much. Sorry I forgot. The word slipped from my mouth so often it lost meaning until even in my own ears I sounded like a woman begging for permission to exist. Trying to please her became my unspoken mission. If she rolled her eyes at my clothes, I went out and bought something newer, brighter, younger. I remember standing in front of the dressing room mirror, tugging at a blouse meant for a woman half my age, telling myself maybe she'd look at me differently if I looked less mom. The fabric clung unkindly, and I hated how foolish I felt, but I bought it anyway. She never noticed. Or if she did, she didn't care. There were birthdays when she wanted parties I couldn't afford. I stayed up late calculating bills, shaving off groceries here and electricity there just to make sure her cake had the frosting roses she wanted, and her friends left with gift bags that looked expensive. Watching her smile as she tore open gifts almost convinced me the sacrifice was worth it. Almost. But by the end of the night, when she tossed the wrapping paper aside without a word of thanks, I was left with nothing but exhaustion and an empty wallet. College was the hardest. She wanted freedom, independence, money for things she called essentials that looked like luxuries to me. I stretched every penny of my retirement savings tutoring after hours grading essays until midnight just to keep her afloat. I told myself I was investing in her future, that every dollar I denied myself was a brick in the road she would walk to success. But I wonder now, was I investing in her future, or was I bribing her love? Even the way I spoke changed. I measured every word like a fragile glass, terrified that the wrong one would shatter whatever thin bridge still connected us. I rehearsed conversations in my head before approaching her softening edges, stripping away anything that might sound critical. I thought if I was endlessly kind, endlessly patient, she would see me as worthy of her respect. But what she saw instead was weakness. Her insults grew bolder the more I yielded. At dinners, she would correct me in front of everyone, rolling her eyes when I misremembered a detail. At gatherings, she joked about how mom doesn't get it, while everyone laughed nervously, unsure whether to defend me or join her. I laughed along too, even as the laughter turned sour in my throat, because I thought it would make her happy. Inside, I was crumbling. Every smile I forced chipped away at me. Every apology I gave for no reason hollowed me out further. And still I told myself it was the price of motherhood, that if I endured long enough, she would come to appreciate the sacrifices. There was one night I will never forget. She was home from school and we sat in the living room watching television. A commercial for some new gadget came on and she sighed dramatically. God, you're so old-fashioned, Mom. You don't even know how half these things work. It's like talking to a dinosaur sometimes. The words were careless, tossed like scraps, but they pierced me. I laughed weakly and replied, well, maybe this dinosaur still has some tricks left. I tried to make it light, but when I glanced at her, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't even looking at me. She was back on her phone scrolling, dismissing me as if I were no more significant than background noise. That night, I cried myself to sleep, clutching the pillow, as though it could absorb the ache of being invisible. Trying to please her didn't mend the cracks. It widened them. Because love that comes at the cost of your dignity isn't love, it's submission. And the more I gave up pieces of myself, the more she treated me as though I had nothing left worth giving. Still I persisted. Still I bent. because the thought of her turning away completely was more terrifying than the daily wounds. And yet, deep inside, a voice whispered, "What happens when you have nothing left to give?" That question haunted me. At the time, I didn't have an answer. But I would soon learn it was the only question that mattered. There's a peculiar kind of pain that comes when cruelty stops shocking you. At first, it's a wound, sharp, undeniable, demanding attention. But over time, the sting dulls, the surprise fades, and the insults settle into your life like unwelcome furniture. You don't like them, but you learn to move around them. That's what happened between Lena and me. Her mockery became routine, so common that silence was the only way I could endure it. It wasn't just one or two occasions. It was every gathering, every family meal, every casual encounter where words should have been harmless. I began to recognize the pattern, the way she would wait until conversation lulled, the way her tone would sharpen just enough to draw attention, the way her eyes would flick toward me with something almost like triumph when she delivered the blow. One Sunday afternoon, we had relatives over for lunch. I had cooked all morning, pouring my effort into dishes I hoped would bring comfort: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, apple pie. When we sat down to eat, one of my nieces complimented the food. "Aunt Margaret, this is amazing. Do you cook like this every week?" Before I could answer, Lena snorted. "Trust me, it's not always like this. Most days it's bland, healthy stuff no one under 70 would want to eat." The table erupted with awkward laughter, the kind meant to diffuse tension rather than celebrate humor. My niece looked down at her plate, unsure of how to respond. I forced a smile and shrugged, murmuring something about trying to keep everyone alive. But inside, shame burned. It wasn't about the food. It was about the way my daughter wanted to remind the room that I wasn't someone to admire, that even in the one domain where I still felt capable, she could strip the dignity away with a single sentence. Later, when the guests left and I was cleaning up, she breezed past me without offering to help. She paused only to say, "Don't look so wounded, Mom. It was just a joke." But jokes are meant to amuse both sides. This was different. This was cruelty packaged as humor, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew I wouldn't fight back. And she was right, I didn't. The repetition wore me down. I could list the insults like chapters in a book. "You wouldn't understand, Mom, you're too old." "God, don't talk like that, it's embarrassing." "Why do you always make everything about you?" "You're so out of touch, it's sad." Sometimes she said them in front of family, sometimes in front of her friends, and sometimes when it was just the two of us. In those private moments, the cruelty cut deeper. At least when others were around, I could pretend it was her performance. But when she said it alone, it felt more honest, more deliberate. I found myself anticipating the insults. Before speaking, I rehearsed my words silently, trying to strip away anything she might mock. When guests visited, I grew quieter, speaking less, as though minimizing myself might protect me. It didn't. She always found a way. One evening, we attended a wedding together. She looked radiant in her dress, hair styled perfectly, laughter ringing out as she mingled with cousins and old friends. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, sipping sparkling water, content just to watch her joy. Then, during a lull in conversation, she turned toward me and announced loudly, "My mom's never really understood how to have fun. She's more of a background person." Laughter again, quick and uncomfortable. My cheeks flamed. A background person. As though my life's role was to exist silently in the wings, supporting her spotlight. I excused myself to the restroom, staring into the mirror at the woman reflected back. She looked tired, older than her years, eyes heavy with something more than fatigue. For the first time, I whispered to my reflection, "Maybe she's right." That thought frightened me, because if I accepted it, I would lose myself entirely. And yet, with every repeated jab, I felt myself shrinking closer to that fate. There's another truth about routine cruelty. It changes not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. I began to internalize her words. When she called me clueless, I believed it. When she called me pathetic, I wondered if she was right. Her voice became my inner critic, replaying in my head long after she stopped speaking. My husband noticed, though he rarely intervened. Once after dinner, when Lena had mocked me for mispronouncing a word, he muttered, "She doesn't mean it." But the look in his eyes betrayed discomfort. Guilt even. Still, he stayed silent, and so did I. Silence became our family's chosen language. But the silence was heavy, suffocating. I carried it with me everywhere, the supermarket, church walks, in the park. Even when she wasn't around, I felt the weight of her disdain pressing on my shoulders. And yet, I kept trying. That was the cruelest part of it all. Even as her insults became routine, I continued bending myself in hopes that one day she would stop. I made her favorite meals, bought her gifts, praised her achievements. I swallowed my hurt and smiled when she dismissed me, believing that love demanded such sacrifice. But love built on humiliation isn't love, it's bondage. By the time I realized this, the pattern was carved deep. She insulted, I endured. She mocked, I forgave. She dismissed, I remained. The routine had become our relationship, and I foolishly thought enduring it was the only way to keep her close. I didn't yet know that breaking this cycle would come at a cost, but also with a liberation I hadn't imagined possible. Breaking points don't arrive with polite announcements. They creep in silently, like a storm gathering behind your back. You don't notice until the first bolt of lightning splits the sky, until thunder rattles the windows, and you realize, this is it. For me, the breaking point came one evening that began like so many others, a simple family dinner. The table was set neatly, the roast chicken steaming in the center, potatoes, whipped smooth, and buttery green beans gleaming with olive oil. I had been humming softly while preparing it, all determined to create a moment of calm. I told myself, if I set the stage just right, maybe tonight will be different. Maybe she'll look at me with kindness. She arrived late, sweeping into the room with her phone in her hand and the faintest trace of irritation on her face. Her father looked up from carving the chicken, his expression a mixture of welcome and weariness. I, as always, tried to soften the air. "Long day?" I asked gently. "Obviously," she replied, dropping into her chair. "Work is exhausting when you actually have a career, you know." The words stung, but I smiled, brushing them aside as I had learned to do. Conversation faltered, then picked up again in patches: the weather, a neighbor's new dog, her brother's recent project. For a moment, I allowed myself to think the evening might pass without incident. But cruelty doesn't wait politely. It demands an audience. Halfway through the meal, I asked her about a presentation she'd mentioned the week before. I thought it was a safe question, one that showed interest without intruding. She sighed dramatically, rolled her eyes, and said, "Mom, can you stop pretending you understand anything about what I do? You barely even keep up with the news. Honestly, it's embarrassing when you try to sound smart." The words landed like a slap, loud and sharp. The table fell silent. My fork hovered above my plate, my appetite evaporating. Her brother looked down, cheeks flushing. My husband cleared his throat but said nothing. I tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in my throat. I was just trying to show interest. "Well, don't," she snapped, stabbing at her food. "It makes things worse when you fake it." Fake it. That's what she thought of me. That my every effort to connect, every question asked, every smile forced through my exhaustion, all of it was false. Pretending. Nothing but theater to her. Something inside me splintered. I stared at her across the table, her face so familiar and yet so foreign. This was the child I had cradled through fevers, the teenager I had chauffeured to late-night practices, the young woman I had scraped and saved to support through college. And here she was, looking at me as though I were beneath her. For years I had swallowed the insults. For years I had convinced myself that silence was strength, that endurance was love. But in that moment I felt my body refuse. My chest tightened, my hands trembled, and my voice, quiet but steady, rose before I could stop it. "That's enough." The words startled even me. They were not loud, but they carried weight, slicing through the silence. Her fork clattered against the plate as she looked up, eyes wide. "What?" That's enough, I repeated, my voice firmer this time. I will not sit here and let you speak to me like this. The table froze. My husband's eyes darted between us, unsure whether to intervene. Her brother's fork paused midair. But I didn't waver. For the first time in years, I met her gaze directly, refusing to lower my eyes. She scoffed, trying to mask her surprise. "Oh, so now you've found your voice after all this time." "Yes," I said simply, "and you don't get to take it away again." The words hung in the air, electric. I could see the disbelief flicker across her face, quickly replaced by anger. She opened her mouth to fire back, but something in my expression must have stopped her. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't bending. I was standing. Dinner ended awkwardly. She stormed away from the table, muttering about how dramatic I was being, how oversensitive. My husband followed her with his eyes but said nothing, retreating into silence as he always did. I cleared the plates with shaking hands, my body buzzing with adrenaline. In the quiet kitchen, tears finally came. Not the usual tears of humiliation, but tears of release. For the first time, I hadn't swallowed the pain. I had spit it out, placed it on the table where it belonged. It wasn't victory, not yet. The wound was still raw, the air still thick with tension. But it was the first crack in the walls I had built around myself. The first step toward reclaiming something I had forgotten. I possessed my dignity. That night, lying awake in bed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew things would change now. She would push back harder. She would test my resolve. But I also knew I couldn't return to silence. Once a voice is found, it cannot be buried again. The breaking point had arrived, and I had crossed it. And though the road ahead would be stormy, I knew this. I would never again let my daughter reduce me to a shadow. Not anymore. A quiet resolution does not come like fireworks. It doesn't roar or announce itself with applause. It arrives softly, like the slow unfolding of dawn after a sleepless night. That's how it felt the morning after my breaking point. I woke before anyone else, sunlight barely touching the curtains, my chest still heavy from the confrontation at dinner. My body was tense, braced for the fallout. For years, I had lived in a cycle, endure the insult, cry in private, smooth things over the next day. That was my rhythm, my twisted ritual of motherhood. But when I sat at the kitchen table that morning with a cup of coffee cradled between my palms, something inside me felt different. Not triumphant, no, but steady. The words I had spoken, "That's enough," still echoed in my mind. I had imagined that standing up to her would leave me shattered, terrified of losing her love entirely. Instead, there was a strange sense of clarity, almost relief. For once, I hadn't let her trample me. For once, I had drawn a line. I realized then that I didn't need to scream or rage to reclaim myself. I didn't need to fight her on her battlefield of sharp words and rolled eyes. My strength could be quiet, deliberate. My rebellion could be in choosing not to play her game anymore. It began with small choices. When she emerged later that morning, groggy and still seething, I greeted her with calm politeness, but nothing more. She dropped her coffee cup on the counter with a clatter, waiting for me to swoop in and make her breakfast like always. Instead, I kept reading the newspaper. After a moment, she muttered something under her breath and made it herself. It was such a tiny moment, almost laughable, but it sent a ripple through me. I don't have to serve her every whim. Later that week, she asked me to do her laundry because she didn't have time. Normally, I would have nodded, eager to lighten her load to win a scrap of gratitude. Instead, I looked her in the eye and said, "No, you can manage it yourself." Her mouth fell open in disbelief. "What's gotten into you?" "Nothing," I replied simply. "I'm just not doing it." Her frustration boiled over, muttering about how unhelpful I was, how mothers were supposed to support their children. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let her words roll off me, a storm that no longer had the power to uproot me. Inside, my heart pounded, but outwardly I remained calm. That was my quiet resolution. I would no longer beg for her approval, nor would I fuel her cruelty with my tears. I would refuse her demands without anger, set boundaries without drama. I would reclaim my dignity not through noise but through stillness. Of course she tested me. She pushed harder, throwing sharper insults, trying to provoke the old pattern. One evening, when I declined to give her money for something frivolous, she sneered, "You're pathetic, clinging to your little savings like it matters. No wonder no one takes you seriously." The old me would have crumbled. I would have cried later, maybe even caved in to her demand just to make the cruelty stop. But that night I only said, "If you feel that way, then so be it." And I walked away. I could see the confusion in her eyes. She expected a reaction. She wanted to see me wounded, but there was nothing for her to feed on. In the quiet of my room later, I sat with the strangeness of it. I still hurt, of course I did. Words like hers don't bounce off. They bruise. But I realized I no longer felt chained to her approval. I didn't need her kindness to validate my worth. For the first time, the balance shifted. Her cruelty did not define me anymore. That realization bled into other parts of my life. I started going for long walks after dinner, something I hadn't allowed myself in years, because I thought I needed to be home, ready to serve. I dusted off old books I had once loved, rereading them in the garden, rediscovering the quiet joy of losing myself in words. I even called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone I had pushed away, because Lena once told me she was boring. Each small act was a stitch sewing me back into myself. It wasn't easy. Some nights I lay awake, guilt gnawing at me. That old voice whispered, "You're abandoning her. You're failing as a mother." But another voice, quieter, stronger, rose to meet it. "No, you are saving yourself." That was my resolution. To stop begging for love where there was none. To stop shrinking myself to fit inside her contempt. To live as my own person, not as her doormat. The change was subtle at first, but it grew. And though she didn't know it yet, Lena was about to discover a mother she had never met before, a woman who would no longer bend until she broke. Because once you taste the freedom of not needing someone's approval, you cannot go back to chains. And I had no intention of ever wearing them again. The first time Lena realized the balance between us had shifted, it wasn't during some explosive fight. No, just like my resolution, it revealed itself in silence, in the space where my old self would have bent and apologized, but didn't. It happened one afternoon in the grocery store. She had tagged along, scrolling her phone as we moved through the aisles. I pushed the cart quietly, enjoying the ordinary rhythm of choosing vegetables, weighing apples, comparing prices. Then she stopped suddenly in front of a display of imported chocolates, expensive and neatly wrapped in gold foil. "Get me these," she said, dropping a box into the cart without looking up from her screen. Once I would have agreed instantly, justifying the indulgence as a way to earn her fleeting smile. I would have sacrificed something else, bread, milk, my own small comforts to make room for it. But not this time. I lifted the box from the cart and set it back on the shelf. "Not today." Her head snapped up, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean, not today?" "I mean, we don't need them," I said simply. "They're not on the list." She scoffed as if the word list itself was laughable. "God, Mom, you're so cheap. It's embarrassing." I felt the sting of those words, but I didn't flinch. I just kept pushing the cart forward. No explanation, no apology. For the first time, she followed me in silence. It was small, but I knew she felt it, that quiet refusal, that invisible wall I had built between us. And though she didn't admit it, I could see the surprise in her face. The balance shifted again at home. She had gotten used to me being her personal maid, cooking, cleaning, doing her laundry, even tidying her room when she left clothes strewn across the floor. It had always been easier for me to do it than to face her anger. But now I stopped. One evening, she burst into the living room holding up a pile of unfolded laundry. "Why didn't you wash these?" "Because they're yours," I said evenly. "You can do them yourself." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Are you serious?" "Yes." She dropped the clothes onto the couch and glared. "You've changed. What's your problem lately?" I looked her in the eye. No problem. Just new boundaries. Her father glanced up from his paper, his eyes flicking between us. For once, I didn't look to him for rescue or support. I didn't need him to back me up. This wasn't about him. It was between me and her. Lena huffed and stormed off, muttering under her breath. But she didn't throw the clothes at me again. She carried them upstairs. I sat back on the couch, my heart pounding, and realized this was how the balance shifted, not in one dramatic battle, but in 1,000 small refusals, each one reclaiming a piece of my dignity. It wasn't just about chores or money. It was about the way I carried myself. When she mocked me in front of her friends, "Don't mind my mom, she's clueless about everything," I no longer laughed along to smooth things over. I didn't scold her either. I just stayed silent, steady, letting the weight of her words fall flat without my cooperation. And something remarkable happened. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, some even giving me sympathetic glances. Without my compliance, the cruelty lost its charm. Another time she ridiculed me at dinner for mispronouncing a word. Normally, I would have blushed, apologized, maybe even joked at my own expense to ease the tension. Instead, I said, "I like the way I said it," and continued eating. My calmness unnerved her. She tried to push harder, but the power wasn't there anymore. I noticed something then. Her insults thrived on my reactions. The humiliation, the tears, the forced laughter that was the fuel. Without it, her words drifted away like smoke. And I was done feeding the fire. Of course, Lena didn't give up easily. One weekend, she wanted me to cancel plans with an old friend so I could drive her across town. "You can see your friend anytime. I need this ride now." I looked at her steadily. "No, Lena. I already made my plans, and I won't break them." Her eyes widened as if I had spoken a foreign language. "You're choosing your friend over me." "I'm choosing myself," I replied quietly. She didn't know what to do with that. She stormed upstairs, slammed her door, and left me sitting in the living room with the strangest feeling blooming in my chest: pride. Pride that I hadn't abandoned myself again. When I met my friend later that afternoon, I laughed freely for the first time in months. The sound startled me. It had been so long since laughter felt natural instead of forced. My friend noticed. "You look lighter," she said. "What's changed?" Everything, I whispered. The balance shift wasn't just between me and Lena. It rippled through the family. Her brother began to notice, watching me with quiet respect when I said no to her unreasonable demands. He started stepping in more often, telling her to ease up to show some respect. My husband, though slower to react, seemed relieved that the tension wasn't always swallowing me whole. And me, I began to stand taller. My shoulders straightened. My eyes met the mirror without flinching. It was as if I had been living hunched beneath a weight for years, and piece by piece I was setting it down. Lena hated it, of course. She tried sarcasm sharper than before, insults more pointed, hoping to pierce my new armor. But each time I remained calm. My silence was no longer submission, it was strength. And slowly she began to realize the mother she had always controlled was gone. The balance had shifted. And though the battles ahead would be harder, I knew something with certainty: I was no longer afraid of her. When you change the script of a family drama, the audience doesn't know what to do with themselves. They shuffle, glance at one another, fumble their lines. That's what happened when I stopped bending to Lena's will. The shockwaves rippled through every corner of our household, unsettling everyone who had grown comfortable with the old roles. At first it was subtle. A raised eyebrow from my husband when I refused Lena's demand for money. A sideways glance from her brother when I let her snide remark pass without rising to the bait. But the tension built undeniable until it filled our home like a low hum you couldn't escape. For years I had been the buffer, the peacemaker, the one who absorbed every blow so the house could remain calm. My silence had been the mortar holding us together even as it buried me. Now that I refused to play that role, cracks began to show in the walls of our family. The first real shock came at another dinner. Lena asked me, no, ordered me to drive her across town the next morning because she couldn't be bothered with public transportation. My old self would have sighed, rearranged my plans, and complied. But the new me, I shook my head. I have errands of my own, I said evenly, scooping vegetables onto my plate. The silence that followed was so heavy you could feel it in your bones. What, she snapped, her fork frozen midair. I said no, I repeated, meeting her eyes without flinching. Her brother, usually silent during our spats, let out a low whistle. Wow, didn't see that coming. Lena's face reddened. You've got to be kidding me. Since when do you say no? Since now, I replied. She shoved her chair back with a screech, muttering curses as she stormed upstairs. The slam of her door rattled the chandelier. My husband cleared his throat, setting his fork down. Margaret, was that necessary? I turned to him, my voice calm but firm. Yes, it was. He blinked at me clearly, unsure how to respond. He had grown so used to me smoothing everything over that he didn't know how to exist in this new balance. But the true shockwaves didn't come from Lena's rage. They came from the ripple effect my changes had on everyone else. Her brother began speaking up more often, something he had never dared to do before. When Lena mocked me for not understanding technology, he shot back. She understands more than you think. Maybe show some respect. I saw the flicker of surprise in Lena's eyes, not just at his words, but at the realization that her dominance was no longer absolute. Even my husband, quiet, conflict-avoidant, content to let storms pass, began shifting. One evening, when Lena snapped at me for forgetting to buy her favorite snack, he stepped in. That's enough, Lena. You can buy it yourself next time. The silence that followed was electric. For years he had stayed silent, leaving me alone in the battlefield. But now, perhaps emboldened by my refusal to bend, he was finding his voice too. And Lena hated it. Her behavior escalated. She tried sharper insults, louder confrontations, desperate to push me back into my old role. When those didn't work, she turned to sulking silence, slamming doors, leaving the house for hours without saying where she was going. One night, she returned late, clearly expecting me to be waiting up to scold or worry. Instead, I was already in bed reading a book. She hovered at my door, startled. "You didn't wait up?" she asked, incredulous. I looked up from my book. "No. You're an adult. I trust you to manage your own choices." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. She stood there for a long moment, then shut the door quietly. For the first time, I felt the ground shifting beneath her. Of course, the shift unsettled me, too. I had spent so long measuring my worth by her moods that I sometimes felt unmoored, uncertain. There were nights I lay awake, my heart pounding, wondering if I was doing the right thing. What if this pushes her away completely? What if she never forgives me? But then I remembered the alternative, a lifetime of bending, breaking, begging, and I knew I could never go back. The wider family began to notice too. At gatherings, when Lena took a jab at me, I no longer laughed it off. I simply looked at her, steady and silent, letting the weight of her cruelty hang in the air until it embarrassed her. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, some even speaking up. That was uncalled for Lena. It was as if the entire family had been waiting for me to change, and once I did, they found their courage too. The shockwaves spread. One of the most profound moments came unexpectedly. I was in the garden one afternoon, tending to the roses, when Lena appeared at the back door. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching me. "You're different," she said finally. I kept pruning, not looking up. "Maybe." "No, really," she pressed. "It's like, you don't care anymore." I set the shears down and met her gaze. "I care. But I care about myself too now." Her eyes flickered confusion, frustration, something else I couldn't quite name. She muttered something under her breath and disappeared back inside. But her words lingered with me. She was noticing. She was rattled. The power she had wielded so effortlessly was slipping. The shockwaves were not easy. They came with arguments, slammed doors, awkward silences, and nights where the air felt thick enough to choke. But beneath it all, there was something stronger, rising: respect. Not yet fully formed, not yet admitted, but growing like a seed in the cracks of old concrete. And as I sat in my garden that evening, the roses blooming around me, I realized that shockwaves are not just destructive. They are the force that breaks old foundations so new ones can be built. And I was ready to build. When people lose control, they don't let go gracefully. They fight. They claw. They grasp at the old ways with every ounce of strength, terrified of the new order pressing in. That's exactly what Lena did once she realized I wasn't folding beneath her words anymore. Her pushback was desperate, loud, and unrelenting. She tried everything, old tactics, sharpened new ones, invented, all to yank me back into the box she had kept me in for years. But what she didn't understand was that once a woman learns she can stand, she cannot go back to crawling. It began with mockery turned crueler than before. One evening, we had guests over, neighbors we'd known for years. The conversation drifted to technology, and I admitted with a chuckle that I still preferred paper books to e-readers. It was a harmless remark, one that once would have been met with a polite smile. But Lena seized it like a weapon. "Of course you do," she said loudly, rolling her eyes. "Mom's basically allergic to anything invented after 1990. Laughter rippled uncomfortably around the table. My cheeks flushed, but I didn't shrink. I looked at her steadily and said, "That's fine. I like who I am." The room went silent. The neighbors quickly changed the subject, but I caught the flicker of frustration in Lena's eyes. She had expected me to laugh it off, to make myself the punchline. Instead, I stood firm and her barb landed flat. When mockery failed, she tried provocation. She picked fights over the smallest things, dishes left in the sink. My choice of TV shows, the way I folded laundry. "Why do you always do everything wrong?" she snapped one night, slamming a cabinet door. The old me would have scrambled to appease her, smoothing the situation with apologies. But this new version of me only said, "If you don't like how I do it, you're welcome to do it yourself." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. She stormed upstairs, her footsteps shaking the walls. She escalated again. When the quiet refusals didn't break me, she went for guilt. "You've changed," she said one evening, her voice dripping with accusation. "You don't even act like my mom anymore." I looked at her calmly. "Being your mom doesn't mean letting you treat me badly." Her eyes widened. "So now I'm a bad daughter." I didn't say that, I replied. "But your choices have consequences. And one of them is that I won't be your punching bag." She stared at me, stunned, then turned away with a sharp laugh. But I saw the uncertainty in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped as she walked out. Perhaps the most desperate attempt came with manipulation cloaked as vulnerability. One Saturday morning, she knocked on my door softly. Her voice was different, gentler, almost childlike. "Mom, can you make me breakfast like you used to?" My heart wavered. For a moment, I saw the little girl she had been curling into my lap, asking for pancakes with too much syrup. I almost caved, almost slid back into the comfort of giving. But then I remembered love is not about servitude. So I opened the door and smiled softly. "You know how to cook, Lena. You can make it yourself." Her face hardened instantly, the mask snapping back into place. "Fine. You don't care about me anymore." "I care," I said quietly. "But I care about myself too." She turned and stalked away, but I knew my refusal had pierced deeper than any insult could. She wasn't just angry, she was unsettled. The pushback grew more chaotic in the weeks that followed. Some days she was icy cold, barely speaking to me. Other days she lashed out, slamming doors and accusing me of being selfish, cruel, even unloving. Unloving. That word haunted me. For years I had sacrificed everything to prove my love, bending until I broke. And yet the moment I stopped erasing myself, she called it absence of love. But I didn't waver. I repeated the truth to myself like a prayer. Boundaries are not betrayal. They are protection. Her desperation began to ripple outward too. She tried to rally her father to her side. "Dad, don't you think Mom's being ridiculous lately? She refuses to help me with anything. She's so cold." My husband looked at me, then at her. Slowly, he shook his head. "She's not cold. She's just tired of being mistreated." The shock on Lena's face was palpable. For the first time, her father wasn't her silent ally. For the first time, he saw me clearly. It was then that I realized Lena's pushback wasn't just about control, it was about fear. She wasn't used to seeing me as anything but pliable. My strength unsettled her, forced her to confront the truth she had avoided. I was not infinite. I was not a resource to be exploited. I was a person who had finally learned to say no. One night, during yet another argument, she shouted, "Why are you doing this? Why now?" I looked at her, my voice steady. "Because if I don't, I won't survive you." The words silenced her. She stared at me speechless, as if hearing for the first time the toll her cruelty had taken. She didn't apologize. No, not yet. But she didn't speak again either. She simply walked away. And I knew then the pushback was proof of her desperation, but also proof that my strength was working. Because people only fight so hard when they realize they're losing control. And Lena was losing it. Confrontations don't happen in silence. They build brick by brick until the weight of unspoken words threatens to crush you. That's how it felt in the days leading up to the moment everything spilled over. The air in the house was thick with tension. Every slammed door, every muttered insult, every cold glance was another stone added to the wall rising between Lena and me. I knew eventually that wall would crack. I just didn't expect to be the one holding the hammer. It began on a Sunday evening. Dinner again, always dinner, as though the table itself had become our arena. I had made something simple: pasta with garlic and olive oil, a salad on the side. I wasn't cooking to please anyone anymore. I was cooking because I enjoyed it, because I deserved to eat well, even if no one else appreciated it. Lena sat down with her usual sigh, scrolling through her phone while pushing food around her plate. Her father tried to make conversation, but it slid off her like rain on glass. Then, without warning, she looked up and said, "You know what's funny? Everyone else's moms are actually helpful. Mine just complains and acts like a victim." The words dropped like poison into the air. Her brother froze mid-bite. My husband's fork clattered against his plate. And me, I felt something shift. For years, insults like that had pierced me, sent me running to cry in silence. But this time they didn't cut. They hardened me. I set my fork down, folded my hands, and looked her directly in the eye. "That's enough, Lena." She blinked, startled. "What?" "You've been tearing me down for years," I said, my voice calm but unwavering. "Calling me pathetic, clueless, a burden. And I've let you. I thought if I loved you enough, if I kept pleasing you, maybe one day you'd respect me. But it's clear now you never will. So I'm done." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known. Her mouth opened, but I raised a hand. "No, you're going to listen this time." Her face flushed with anger. "Oh, here we go. Mom's big speech. You think anyone cares?" "I care," I said firmly. "And I should have cared years ago. I let you treat me like a punching bag because I was afraid of losing you. But the truth is, I already lost you a long time ago. The little girl I raised, the one who used to curl into my lap and tell me I was the best mom in the world, she's gone. In her place is someone who looks at me with nothing but contempt." Her eyes flickered, something soft flashing before she masked it with another sneer. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said quietly. "I'm being honest." Her brother shifted uncomfortably, then finally spoke. "She's right, Lena. You've been awful to her. We've all seen it." That shocked her more than my words did. She turned on him, her voice sharp. "Oh, so now you're on her side too." "This isn't about sides," he said. "It's about respect. And you don't give her any." For a moment, Lena looked like she might cry. But pride is a powerful mask. She shoved back her chair, the legs screeching against the floor. "You're all insane." I stayed seated, steady, refusing to rise to her chaos. "Leave if you want," I said. "But know this, I won't chase after you. I won't beg for your approval anymore. If you ever decide to treat me with respect, my door is open. Until then, I'm done sacrificing myself for a daughter who only wants to break me." Her face twisted, caught between fury and something else I couldn't name. Then she stormed out, the slam of the door echoing through the house like a gunshot. The silence that followed was profound. My husband stared at me wide-eyed as though he'd just witnessed something impossible. My son reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You are incredible," he whispered. But I didn't feel incredible. I felt hollow, as though I'd just cut away a piece of myself. My hands trembled under the table, and when I stood to clear the plates, my legs shook. Later, alone in my room, the tears came not of weakness but of release. For the first time in years, I had spoken the truth aloud, not just to her, but to myself. And though the house felt emptier with her absence, it also felt freer. The next morning, I half expected her to come down with a new insult ready to resume the cycle. But her room was empty, her bed unslept in. She had left in the night, retreating to a friend's or perhaps somewhere else. My husband asked if I was worried. I told him the truth, of course I was. She was my daughter, my blood. A mother's love doesn't vanish with a slammed door. But I wasn't desperate anymore. For the first time, I trusted myself enough to let her go. Because sometimes confrontation isn't about winning, it's about declaring, "This is who I am. This is what I will no longer accept." And I had done that. Whether she heard me or not was no longer mine to control. That night, as I sat alone in the garden with the moonlight spilling across the roses, I whispered a prayer into the dark. Let her find her way back, but let me never lose myself again. The night after Lena stormed out, the house felt impossibly quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that pressed in from every corner, reminding you of absence. For years, her voice had filled these rooms, sharp, mocking, relentless, but still present. Now that it was gone, I realized how much space it had occupied in my mind, my body, my very breath. I sat in the living room with a blanket draped over my lap, staring at the clock as it ticked past midnight. My husband pretended to read the paper, but his eyes didn't move across the page. My son scrolled his phone, glancing at me every few minutes, as though checking to see if I would break down. But I didn't. Not in front of them. Because here's the truth: when you finally speak the words you've swallowed for years, the silence that follows doesn't feel like loss. It feels like release. The next morning, her room was still empty. The bed untouched. The dresser littered with half-folded clothes. I stood in the doorway, gripping the frame, 1,000 memories rushing in, braiding her hair before school, tucking her in with fairy tales, watching her twirl in the mirror before her first dance. And now the echo of slammed doors and bitter words. A part of me wanted to run after her, to call every friend she might have stayed with, to beg her to come home. But another part, the stronger part, knew that would undo everything. My silence last night hadn't been surrender. It had been strength. To chase her now would be to hand her the power again. So I closed the door gently and walked away. The days that followed were a strange mix of grief and liberation. Grief because I had to mourn the daughter I once knew, the child who used to reach for my hand, the teenager who used to whisper her dreams into the dark. That girl was gone, replaced by someone harder, sharper, and for now, unreachable. Liberation because I no longer lived under the constant weight of her contempt. The air in the house was lighter. Meals were quieter, yes, but without the sting of ridicule. My son spoke more, filling the silence with stories from work and small jokes that actually made us laugh. My husband, though still uneasy, seemed less tense, as though the storm cloud that hung over us had finally lifted. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, my son said softly, "It's nice, not having to walk on eggshells." His words cut and comforted me all at once. But the aftermath wasn't just within the house. It was within me. For years, my identity had been tied to pleasing Lena. Every choice I made, what I cooked, how I spoke, when I stayed silent, was measured against how she might react. Without that weight, I felt unsteady, like a prisoner who has forgotten how to walk freely after being unchained. I found myself wandering the garden more often, pruning roses, kneeling in the soil, letting the earth remind me of grounding. I opened books I hadn't touched in years, their pages a balm for my weary mind. I even called an old friend, someone I had drifted away from because Lena once mocked her as boring. We sat in a cafe for hours, sipping tea, laughing, catching up. For the first time in so long, I felt seen without having to earn it. Still, the nights were the hardest. There were moments when guilt gnawed at me. What kind of mother tells her daughter she won't beg for her love anymore? I replayed the confrontation in my head, wondering if I had been too harsh, too final. The echo of her face, flushed with anger but shadowed with something almost like hurt, haunted me. But then another thought steadied me. What kind of daughter tears her mother down for years and expects silence in return? I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was honest. And honesty, though painful, is never wrong. A week passed before Lena reached out. It came in the form of a text, short and sharp. "I'm fine. Don't bother checking up on me." My hands trembled as I read it, torn between relief that she was safe and sorrow at the distance in her words. For a long moment I stared at the screen, debating what to reply. Then I typed, "Only, I'm glad you're safe. My door is always open if you want respect between us." She never responded. And yet, for the first time, I didn't spiral into despair at her silence. I had said what I needed to say. The rest was hers to decide. The aftermath of truth isn't clean. It doesn't end with hugs or forgiveness wrapped neatly in a bow. It lingers, messy and uncertain. But it also clears the air, makes space for something new to grow. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun sink below the horizon, the sky awash in gold and violet. My son joined me, handing me a cup of tea. "You know," he said quietly, "I think she'll come around one day." "Maybe," I replied. "But if she doesn't, I'll still be okay." And I meant it. For the first time in years, I truly meant it. Because the truth had cost me my daughter's presence, at least for now, but it had given me back something far greater, myself. There comes a point when grief turns into clarity. After Lena left, after the sting of her words and the silence of her absence, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, one morning, toothbrush in hand, staring at the woman looking back. The lines around my eyes were deeper, the gray in my hair brighter. But for the first time in years, I didn't just see weariness. I saw possibility. Choosing myself again didn't happen with a grand declaration. It happened in tiny, deliberate acts so small they might have seemed invisible to anyone else. But to me, they were revolutions. The first act was giving myself permission to enjoy life without guilt. One Saturday, instead of staying home just in case Lena needed me, I accepted an invitation from an old colleague to join a book club. I walked into that library meeting room with my heart hammering in my chest, nervous that I wouldn't belong anymore. But the moment we began discussing the novel, I felt something spark inside me. Ideas flowed from my lips, my voice steady and alive. For 2 hours, I wasn't a mother enduring insults. I was Margaret, the woman who loved words, who could hold her own in conversation without apology. When I returned home that afternoon, my husband looked at me with surprise. "You're glowing," he said. And I was. Another act of choosing myself came in the garden. For years, I had tended it out of habit, trimming and watering mechanically, more concerned with keeping it tidy for Lena's complaints than with joy. But now I lingered among the roses, inhaling their fragrance, letting the soil coat my hands without shame. I planted new seeds, lavender, marigolds, even a small patch of herbs I had always wanted to try. As I worked, I realized something profound: growth doesn't come from pleasing others. It comes from giving yourself permission to bloom. I also reconnected with friends I had abandoned in my years of appeasement. There was Judith, my childhood friend who I hadn't seen in nearly a decade because Lena once called her pathetic and clingy. When we met for coffee, Judith's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. "You didn't," I said, gripping her hand. "I lost myself, but I'm finding my way back." We laughed until our sides hurt, trading stories, rediscovering the ease that had once defined our bond. And for the first time in years, I didn't care whether Lena would mock me for it. This was my life, my joy, and I had every right to claim it. But perhaps the most radical act of all was learning to rest. I had spent decades putting everyone else's needs above my own, convinced that my worth was measured by how much I could give. Now I let myself sit on the porch with a cup of tea and simply breathe. I let myself nap in the afternoon without guilt. I allowed silence to soothe me instead of suffocate me. It felt strange at first, almost rebellious to put my needs first. But slowly it began to feel natural. Of course, Lena's absence still hurt. There were moments when I passed her empty room and felt a pang of loss so sharp it nearly doubled me over. I still dreamed sometimes of her as a little girl running into my arms with unrestrained love. Waking from those dreams left me hollow, mourning what had been. But I refused to let grief chain me anymore. I carried it with me, yes, but as a reminder, not as a weight. A reminder that love without boundaries is destruction, that self-sacrifice without dignity is not noble, it's erasure. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, my husband cleared his throat. He had been quieter than usual lately, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Finally, he spoke. "I don't think I realized how much you gave up," he said softly. I looked up surprised. "For her. For all of us," he continued. "You bent so far, Margaret. And I just let it happen." His words were heavy, laced with guilt. But I didn't let them drag me back. I reached for his hand and said, "It's not about blame anymore. It's about what I choose now." He nodded slowly, squeezing my hand. And for the first time in years, I felt partnership instead of isolation. Choosing myself again also meant rediscovering the things I had once silenced. I began journaling at night, pouring my thoughts onto paper, untangling the knots of years of silence. Some nights I wrote poems, rough, imperfect, but mine. Other nights I wrote letters I would never send, telling Lena everything I had never dared to say. "Dear Lena," one letter began, "I hope one day you see that my boundaries were not rejection, they were survival." Writing became my way of breathing. And then came the day when I realized I had begun to forgive myself. For years I carried shame like a cloak. Shame for allowing her to treat me so poorly. Shame for not standing up sooner. Shame for losing myself in the process. But one morning, as I stood in the kitchen pouring tea, sunlight spilling across the counter, I whispered aloud, "I did the best I could with what I knew then." The words brought tears to my eyes, but also a strange healing warmth, because it was true. I had done my best. And now, I was doing better. I don't know when or if Lena will come back. Perhaps she will, perhaps she won't. But I've realized something vital: my life cannot hinge on that. I am more than her approval, more than her insults, more than the years I lost trying to please her. I am Margaret, a woman who once forgot herself but who is remembering now. And each day, with every small act of joy, I choose myself again. Peace is a strange thing when you've lived without it for so long. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or celebrations. It slips in quietly, like a guest you never expected but secretly hoped for. That's how it felt in the weeks after Lena left. My house wasn't full of laughter or reconciliation, it was full of space. Space where insults used to echo. Space where silence used to suffocate. Space that for the first time in years belonged to me. I began to notice things I hadn't seen in a long time. The way the morning light spilled across the kitchen floor, painting golden squares on the tiles. The birds that nested in the tree outside my window, chirping their greetings at dawn. The gentle rhythm of my own breath, steady and unhurried. These were details I used to overlook, too consumed by the next demand, the next insult, the next attempt to smooth things over. Now I let myself notice them. And in those small moments, peace found me. But peace didn't mean I stopped thinking about Lena. No mother can cut that cord completely, no matter how frayed it becomes. I still thought of her when I passed her room, when I folded laundry, when I saw young women walking with their mothers in the park. My heart ached for what we had lost, for the tenderness that had once defined us. Yet I no longer let that ache rule me. I stopped asking, "What more can I do to win her love?" Instead, I asked, "What can I do to honor myself?" The answer came in small acts: cooking meals I enjoyed, not ones I thought would please her. Calling friends without worrying if she would mock me. reading novels late into the night simply because they filled me with joy. For once, I wasn't living as a background character in her story. I was living in my own. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, my son joined me. He looked older somehow, more thoughtful, as though he had carried his own quiet burden through all those years. You know, he said softly, I used to wonder why you let her talk to you like that. I sighed. Because I thought it was love. Because I thought if I kept giving, she would finally see me. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you stopped. You deserve better. His words filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. For years, I had been invisible in my own family. To be seen now, even by one child, was enough. Then came the day Lena returned. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no apologies. She appeared at the door one afternoon, her eyes guarded, her voice clipped. I just came to pick up some things. I let her in without fuss, stepping aside as she moved past me. She avoided my gaze, heading straight to her room. I waited in the hallway, my heart pounding, but I didn't chase after her. I didn't beg her to talk. When she emerged with a bag slung over her shoulder, she paused for the briefest moment. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for just an instant I thought I saw something soften there. But then it was gone. She walked out without a word. The door clicked shut, and I stood there strangely calm. Once her silence would have shattered me. Now it was simply another choice she had made. And I understood then peace doesn't depend on whether she comes back, whether she apologizes, whether she ever sees me differently. Peace comes from me, from the way I choose to honor myself, from the dignity I refuse to sacrifice again. I still hope, of course. Hope that one day Lena will remember the mother who held her through fevers, who baked butterfly cakes, who stayed up late sewing costumes and selling books to send her on field trips. Hope that she will understand love isn't measured by how much someone bends, but by how much they stand beside you. But if that day never comes, I will still be whole. Because I've learned that love without respect is poison, that motherhood does not mean martyrdom, that the truest way to love my daughter is to stop letting her destroy me. Now when I wake in the morning, I whisper to myself, I am enough. I say it when I walk in the garden, when I sip tea, when I write in my journal. It feels strange still, but less strange each day. And sometimes when the sun sets and the house is quiet, I think back to the girl Lena once was, the child who called me the best mom in the world. Maybe that version of her still exists somewhere. Maybe not. But I've stopped waiting for her to return. Instead, I've welcomed back the version of me I thought I had lost. The woman who loves words, who tends to roses, who laughs with friends, who knows her worth. And that in the end is enough. I don't tell this story for pity. I tell it because I know there are others like me, mothers, fathers, siblings, partners, people who bend until they nearly break, mistaking endurance for love. To them I say, your dignity matters. Your worth matters. You are allowed to stop pleasing those who will never be pleased. I thought setting boundaries would cost me everything. Instead, it gave me back myself. So if you're listening, wondering if it's time to stand, let my story be your answer. Because peace does not come from begging. It comes from finally choosing yourself. Final reflection and CTA 250 words. And that is where my story ends, not with reconciliation, not with a perfect happy ending, but with peace. A peace I never thought I'd have, one that comes from living without chains. I don't know what will happen between me and Lena in the years ahead. Maybe she'll soften. Maybe she won't. But I know this. I will never again sacrifice my dignity for scraps of love. I have learned that my life is mine to live, and I am stronger than I ever believed. To those of you listening, I wonder, have you ever reached that breaking point? Have you ever stopped bending and finally chosen yourself? If so, I hope my story reminds you that you're not alone. And if you haven't yet, I hope it gives you courage. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story touched you, please share your own experiences in the comments. I want to hear from you, because these stories are not just mine. They belong to all of us who've been invisible, who fought to be seen again. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Grace's Truth, and join me for more stories of pain, courage, and the bittersweet taste of freedom. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply reclaiming your peace.